for those of you just coming in, as I said, I plan on talking maybe 30 to 40 minutes, and then I hope that I can encourage you to share some questions in the chat and some thoughts and maybe some points to clarify. This topic is it's someone that I've researched, but it's also kind of what I've been living for the last several months in my position. So I've got a lot of there's a lot of things that I would love to share with you. And so I'd like to have you guys guide that discussion a little bit. But I do want to work through some things first. Before we start, though, before we really dig in, I want to share two tangential things at the beginning, just to kind of get them out of the way. They sort of relate and they're interesting, but I'll just share these anyway. So the first one is on a technology note. As I was just getting ready for this class, I happened to go to Google. And Google, for those of you who are familiar, will do little different icons and little interactive things to celebrate holidays or public figures, special events. And just by happenstance, the one today, for no particular reason, is celebrating Johannes Gutenberg, who invented the printing press. And I saw that and it just made me chuckle, because I'm going to be talking about technology and how we are using new technologies in the church. And the printing press is the thing that fueled the Reformation and putting the Bible into people's hands and had this amazing effect on the church. So that was just kind of a cool little encouragement for me, and just a interesting thing. The second note that is a sort of a fun mind bender thing to think about. I love sci-fi, and I love kind of just thinking about things in a philosophical way, and just I spend a lot of time, maybe too much sometimes, doing these like kind of mind exercises. But as I was preparing for this evening, it occurred to me that I'm teaching a class about how the pandemic has impacted and changed the church in a class format that is a result of how the impact of the pandemic has changed the church. So it's just kind of that, that just the irony of that. I just thought that was fun to think about, but it kind of is a case for some of the things I'm going to talk about this evening. So with that being said, I'd like to dive in, and I just want to walk through some thoughts that I've organized here. And like I said, I'm encouraging you all to share your questions with me as I move through what I have to share with you, and we'll go from there. So the first thing I want to do is I actually want to rename this class. So as I was preparing, I decided to call it the Post-Pandemic Church. And as I thought about it and reflected on it and started gathering material, it's not the post-pandemic church, it's the church in the post-pandemic world. It's not the pandemic church, it's the church in the pandemic. And what I mean by that is the church is the church, and the pandemic is the pandemic. The church is not diminished or is not taken down or in any way minimized by the pandemic. And for that, I do want to begin with scripture, and there's a number of places we can go, but one that has kind of been a theme for me throughout the pandemic is in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 18. And I'll read it for us to kind of frame this thought. And so Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 reads this way: "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy." Just to draw your attention to verse 18, he is the head of the body. Christ is the head of the body, the church. So the church is the church. The church is the body of Christ. And the pandemic is sort of the context that we are in as we are members of the body. And so I think there's, for me at least, that was a shift in thinking in how is the pandemic affecting the church when really what we should be thinking about is what is the church being called, and how is the church being formed and grown and acting in this world, in this season. And that as we enter this discussion, I want that to kind of frame our thoughts, that no matter what I say, because I'm going to share some statistics. Some of them are good. Some of them can be frightening for especially church leaders and Christians. But the bottom line is that the church is the church. The church has is unaffected by the pandemic. And so I think to move on from that point, um, it's interesting to me, in the Old Testament, there's many names for God. And recently it came to me in a conversation unrelated that we don't use the word in the Old Testament or in the Bible omniscient or omnipotent. We don't use all powerful or all knowing in God. That doesn't come from scripture. But what does come from scripture in Hebrew is El Shaddai, which is God Almighty. And God, so Almighty is different than all knowing and all powerful, right? And when you read through scripture, through the flood account, through wars, through the Israelites wandering through the desert, through the church in Acts, and all of the challenges that Paul faced in the early church in Thessalonica and Corinth, and all of these situations that the church was in, these contexts that the church was in, and even beyond scripture, the Black Plague, the Reformation, the 30 Years War, and now COVID-19, the context around the church changes, but God is El Shaddai, Almighty, and Christ is the head of the church. The church is the church. So with that said, with that frame of thought, I have really four questions that I want to kind of ask myself in front of you, and then hopefully that will spur some questions from you. The first question that I want to reflect on with you is what have I been doing personally during the pandemic? I've been doing a number of things, some of them unrelated to the church. So I've learned how to cut my own hair with the help of my wife, Amy. So there are some things in my life that have changed. But on the church side, I've been doing a lot of research. I've been reading articles from pastors and theologians and church leaders who have been responding and sort of navigating the season as we all have navigated the last year, but with a particular eye to how is the church changing? How is worship different now? How is discipleship different? How do we do pastoral care, which is such a high touch, personal, face-to-face thing that the church does when we can't be face-to-face and when we have to stay distant. So I've been doing a lot of research on those pivots that church leaders that we've been making. The second thing is I've been communicating with people. So most of you know, and if not, so I came on staff here at FPC as the interim youth director. And during the pandemic, we hired a new youth director, and I shifted over to this what is now what we're calling online ministry position. We started out with virtual ministry, and that kind of just virtual sounds like holograms and video games. So we went with online ministry to just clarify what it is. It's ministry online. And in that role, there's no job description in the church that really exists for that, broadly speaking. It's just not a church staff position that was needed or was very prominent before the pandemic. It was out there. And so what I've been doing is reaching out to people in other churches that are in this position, some of them who have been doing it for years, some of them who had to pivot and we're all learning it together. And so bouncing ideas off of one another and looking at creative ways to do ministry in new and exciting formats. And then the third part of that is, of course, learning the tools for technology, just seeing what's out there, what technological tools are available, what new ways of doing things, especially with worship. There's so many different ways that we can engage in worship using the internet, using technology, using recordings, YouTube, all of these things. And so I've spent a lot of time in a practical sense working in that realm, and really spending a lot of time just figuring out, just sorting through it all. Like what can we do? What works? What doesn't work? What's even out there? How can we be creative? Um, in all of this, I generally operate on two questions. And so the first question is to go back to my earlier point that the church is the church and the church doesn't change, but the context changes. And that question is, number one, how are we, meaning the church, the people, the body of Christ, how are we called to respond here and now in this season? That's been a difficult question to navigate over the last 12 months. And I say that because what we've seen with the pandemic is March 13th, 2020, everything shut down, right? Sort of this D-Day moment where everything changed in an instant. And what March 14th looked like when we woke up and were in the pandemic is not what it looks like on April 13th, 2021. We're still in the pandemic, but it doesn't look the same. And so there's the season of the pandemic, but there's almost these micro seasons where my wife and I were just reminiscing last year. I mean, remember when we used to bring our groceries home and sanitize the bag because we didn't know how this thing was transmitted. And now we know. So there's these phases of the pandemic. And so that question, how are we, the church, called to respond here and now? It changes, and it sometimes changes rapidly as we go through these different seasons of the pandemic. The second question that I ask, and I ask it cautiously because it's difficult to know, and it can be dangerous. And that question is, what is on the horizon for the church? So I started out asking myself sort of, what's the church going to look like in 5 years? What's the church called to be in 5 years? And I say that that's a dangerous question to ask because we can get easily caught up in that and completely miss where God is calling us to be the church right now. But I think it is prudent, and I think it is worthwhile to say what's on the horizon. So this is how we're called to serve and to act right now. But what's on the horizon? So to put some kind of meat on that bone, to put some concrete context on that. So I asked myself in worship, how are we called as a church to respond in worship right now in April of 2021, still in the pandemic? And of course, there are people who are still unable to be among people. They're high risk for infection. They haven't had access to the vaccine yet, or for whatever reason. So of course now, online and in-person church is the model. When we asked that question about how are we called to worship last April, it was for safety of everybody, and the most prudent thing to do was to worship online, to put our to keep our people safe, but to still engage in worship. And then looking forward, what's on the horizon for worship? Will there be a day where online worship will no longer be called for, or there'll be a need for it? Or is this something that we'll always have as part of our worshiping body? And those questions are helpful to ask because as we decide how we're going to do it now, it's important, if we're going to be doing it in the long run, that we develop those ways of engaging in worship. I hope that sort of makes sense. So that's what my past year has looked like in this pandemic, and that's sort of where my assessment of things comes from. So what I have learned, concrete things that, and I've just pulled out some of the most interesting ones, and maybe the shocking or the most relevant. But the first thing that I've learned, which I think most of us realize, is that our world will never be the same. The effect of the pandemic will change us globally forever. The impact of what this past year has been and beyond it will stick with us. And it's the analogy that many scholars, researchers, bloggers, writers draw is, World War II, the world was changed, the nation was changed. We had this common cause, and we had this major global event. And after that, the impacts still affect who we are. They still shape our identity. They still can be seen and felt in our collective society, even globally. 9/11 is a huge one. I mean, I'm part of the generation that is sort of defined by our formative years being when 9/11 happened. I was in high school. And so I remember a time, vaguely, but I remember a time when you could take somebody to the airport and walk right up to the gate with them. And then I, of course, remember when TSA started and checkpoints, and when all of these things started to change, which are now part of our everyday life, and we don't even think about them; they're just part of our life. And so it's clear that we know that these things, the effects of the pandemic, will be felt forever. And it's not just so. It's interesting to me. Of course, I love to see and to think about and to focus on how that impacts the church and how it impacts worship and discipleship and pastoral care. But these things affect all spheres of life. I've been talking a lot lately now that schools are beginning to reopen. And I was just having a conversation earlier with another parent who has an elementary school aged child. And I was saying, I wonder if online school will always be an option for students from now on. We've shown that some students thrive in online school. We know that some don't. But that may be something that post-pandemic, when the pandemic is in the history books, um, 50 years down the road, people may say, a kid may say, I wonder where online school did come from, and it's still just a thing. We don't know, but that impact is there. So again, the effects, it's going to change us. It has changed us, and it will. And I think in that note, online worship, online discipleship, online pastoral care, those are things that will be with us. And in a little bit, I'm going to share some statistics behind that and kind of give you a research-based picture of what we see happening and what we see on the horizon. But I just want to kind of put that out there. The second really interesting thing I've learned is that the pandemic is a catalyst and not a cause. And what I mean by that is that the pandemic has been blamed for a lot of things. It's been said that it's caused, restaurants to close. It's caused businesses to go out of business. It's caused church attendance to go down. It's caused churches to close their doors. That may be true in some cases. So I don't want to generalize and say that that's never the case. The pandemic may have caused those specific things. But by and large, what we see is that the pandemic's simply been a catalyst for trends that were already headed in that direction before the pandemic. So if you look at a church, a hypothetical church that has closed its doors in the pandemic, when we go and we kind of dig into that and see sort of what has happened there, most often attendance was dropping well before the pandemic. Giving was dropping before the pandemic. Engagement with discipleship, with worship, the opinions, the thoughts that people shared about their spiritual, how they were being nourished spiritually and grown spiritually, was way, way, way before the pandemic, already kind of in that season of downturn. But of course, what has happened is where that church may have taken a decade to eventually close its doors, took several months because the pandemic just accelerated that. Students who struggle in school, who have had major negative impacts from the pandemic. The pandemic didn't take a perfect model student and make them a terrible student. It catalyzed something that was already there, whether it may be an emotional or mental health aspect of that student, or an academic tendency that was they were getting by, but were not doing great, and the pandemic just catalyzed that and just amplified it, and kind of it caused it, but it was something that was underlying it, magnified an underlying condition. And so in church we see that. Um, there's a lot of negatives, right? There's a lot of negative impacts of the pandemic, and a lot of ways that the pandemic has catalyzed negative change. But there's also a ton of positives. Now that we're a year out and we look back, the number of churches that have grown online discipleship and are doing it well has exploded. And the pandemic was a catalyst for that, because when you look at the churches that are thriving online, they were doing spiritual formation well before the pandemic, and they were catalyzed and motivated to grow that online. You most likely won't see a church that was not nourishing its people well spiritually now thriving online. The pandemic didn't cause them to become a spiritually nourishing church, if that makes sense. So it's a small point, but it's really interesting to think about that the pandemic doesn't necessarily cause these things, but it definitely is a catalyst for change and for growth, either in a negative direction or a positive direction. And it's amplified, in many cases, things that were already underlying the surface for us personally, but also, for a church and for organizations as well. The third thing that I've learned, and this is a possibly, at first it's a shocking statistic, and it's grim. So I just want to prepare you for that. But I just recently read a statistic as I was digging through this, and I think this is from Gallup. And what they found is that in 2020, so pandemic year, 47% of Americans say that they belong to a church. 47% of Americans say that they belong to a church. So church membership, however that's defined, but 47%. That's shocking, because that is the first time since Gallup has been doing this poll that percentage has been below 50%. But to go back to my earlier point that the pandemic is a catalyst, not a cause. So 2020, 47% of people claim to be members of a church. 2018, it was 50%. If we go back just under a decade to 1999, it was 70%. So between 1999 and 2018, it dipped from 70% to 50%. And then in the pandemic, it dipped to 47%. So church membership is declining in the US rapidly. But that's not a pandemic cause. Again, that's a trend that was already happening. The other interesting part of that is that almost all researchers that I've seen comment on this statistic, and church leaders, agree that that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is Paul Prather is a pastor at Bethesda Church, and he had an article that he wrote commenting and kind of digging through this statistic, and he lists out some ideas and some things that he has seen as a pastor for over 30 years, and a writer and a academic scholarly writer, that probably caused that. And they're things that aren't really earth-shattering, but the causes of that. But he concludes his article by saying this. He says, in the future, Christianity, historically the country's largest faith by far, will have to adjust to becoming an ever smaller slice of the spiritual pie. That's not necessarily a bad thing, he says. The earliest Christians were barely more than an obscure splinter group, but they were serious, and they persevered, and they changed the world. So the statistics are shocking, right? The church membership is dropping, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? The early church was a splinter group. They were a countercultural movement, and they changed the world. But notice what Paul Prather says. He says that they were serious, they persevered, and then they changed the world. So that when we look at the pandemic and we look at the church and we look at the state of the church, and I go back to that question, what is the church called to be here and now? The church is called to persevere. The church is called to be serious. The church is called to be that church in Acts that was an obscure splinter group, but thrived and changed the world. So the things that I've learned, ultimately, all of them leave me hopeful and joyful for where we are now as a church, but also where we're called to be. And when I look at what's on the horizon, I am overwhelmingly optimistic and positive and hopeful and joyful, because the church thrives, the church perseveres, and the stage is set for the church to do exactly that. So I just, the third question, just kind of moving through these, what do I think? So this is my opinion. This is just kind of synthesizing all the things that I've experienced and read and kind of dug into. What do I think is here and now for the church? Where do I think we are now? And as I said, the church is called to be the church. The Presbyterian Book of Order, which some of you may be familiar with, identifies what it calls the great ends of the church. And I am in these because of my process, where I am in my ordination process and studying for my exam. But nonetheless, these hit me the other day as I was reading through this. And I'll just read a few of them for you. So the Presbyterian Book of Order identifies the great ends of the church as that the proclamation of the gospel for the salvation of mankind. That's what the church is. The shelter, nurture, spiritual fellowship of the children of God. The maintenance of divine worship. The preservation of truth. The promotion of social righteousness. And the exhibition of the kingdom of heaven to the world. All of those things, that's what the church is called to be. And the church is those things in the pandemic. The pandemic doesn't limit our ability to proclaim the gospel for the salvation of humankind. The pandemic doesn't cause us to be unable to maintain divine worship, to exhibit the kingdom of heaven to the world. There's new opportunities and new ways to do that. It may not be the way we've always done it, but the church is the church, and the great ends of the church are just as real and achievable in the pandemic as they were before it. And so to that end, the other thing I see here and now is just that the church remains the church, but the tools change. And last night, hopefully you were able to tune into Nat's class on technology and spiritual formation. It's a great class. It should be up online. Hopefully by the weekend, I'm working on the edit for that. But he said something in that class that has shaped my thinking on this. He was talking about the flood and about Noah building the ark and that use of technology in the unfolding of God's plan. The tools change. The ark is technology. Zoom is technology. Zoom is a tool. And Larry was sharing just before the class started about how in his church that Sunday school and small groups and Bible studies are expanding and proliferating. And Zoom has given them the ability to transcend the boundaries of geography, to bring in people who from anywhere in the globe, and to be in discipleship and fellowship together. I saw a few minutes ago that Ashley Sherman signed on. Ashley's in California, and she's taught several of these master classes for us from California, which before we employed the use of Zoom as a ministry tool, never would have happened, right? So the tools change, and we've got this exciting opportunity to learn and to grow in these new tools, and ultimately achieving the great ends of the church, just using a new toolbox. So as you can tell, I'm super excited. I think here and now the church is thriving, and I think from what I've seen and what I've experienced, I'm immensely hopeful. I do want to share one slide with you real quick, just to kind of put a few numbers behind this. I do want to be a little bit research driven. So what you see in front of you, there's a lot of information on this slide, but I'll just kind of walk you through these two circles in front of you. So if you look to the left, the 67%, this is from Barna Labs. And Barna did a poll. They've been working diligently in the pandemic to get some useful data into the hands of church leaders as we develop strategies for online ministry. And what they found, this first number, is that 67% of churched adults whose churches previously did not have digital services say there is now an online option. These are all people who are polled who are engaging in online worship. So the other 36% already had online worship, but you see that a majority of churches have learned and employed these new tools for ministry, and people are engaging with it. These are church adults who are still engaged in church. So that's exciting to see that the majority of churches are thriving in growing online ministry. The second number on the right, 90% primarily engaged with the same church they were committed to before the pandemic. So what that means is, if I attended a church before the pandemic, even if it was only in person and now they're online, 90% of people have stayed engaged and committed to that church. That is a sort of staggering statistic, because the assumption that many of us have had as digital and online ministry people who are new to the game, we had this fear that we are going to lose all of our people to churches that have been doing it already and do it better because they've got the experience. And that's just not the case. People are staying engaged with the church and are committed to the church. And as we see, the churches are employing these new tools. One other statistic I'll share with you just quickly, because we're all on Zoom. 6 in 10 church adults hope that even post COVID-19, churches will keep using digital means to gather people together. So put all of those together. People who are engaged with the church, for the most part, are staying engaged and committed to the church. The majority of churches are employing these new tools to reach and to nourish and to engage in worship with their people online. And of those people, 60% of them expect and hope that even once the pandemic is gone, that these digital tools and these new ways of doing ministry and church and life together remain in place. So all of those and all of that to say that the picture from what I've seen of the here and now is positive, which is exciting. The final thing I'll say is what do I see on the horizon, and it's just that it is very easy to be discouraged, and especially early on in the pandemic. I think speaking for myself only, we've had to fight through that. I had these assumptions that things were going to be terrible for a long time, and it was a challenge. Things were difficult. But by and large, what we see in the church online world and from online ministry is that it's overwhelmingly positive. And the reason for that, the only thing I can confidently say, I read along my way in this past year, someone said with all of the changes and all of the things day to day going on, and we never knew what was coming next and the rapid changes. But somebody said, the only thing, if you preach or teach or do discipleship or whatever, the only thing for which you can claim perfection is the word of God, is the gospel. And so as I started out with Colossians 1, I'll wrap it up with this by saying the only thing, the reason that I am joyful and the only thing I can say for sure in all of this is that the church is the church. The church was the church before the pandemic, in the pandemic, and post-pandemic, until Christ returns. The church is the church. Just the context around us, the ways we do it, the ways we engage may change. We got to learn some new tools, but the church is the church. So with that, I am there's plenty of time left. So I would love to hear some of your questions about online ministry, digital ministry, church online, any experiences I've had, any things I've learned. That would be I'm all ears.
Okay, thanks, Joel. This is it's just really exciting to even have this conversation. So there are some questions and comments, and so I'll just kind of go down the list. The first is talk a little bit about how you see FPC specifically moving forward with technology. What will it look like?
That is a great question. And I'm glad somebody asked it. So right now, I'll start with the here and now, and I'll start with what I see on the horizon looking forward. So right now, we as a church, as FPC, um, we had things in place online for ministry already, which was great. We had online streaming, we had social media, we had a website, we have a website. We've got the tools are there. The way in which we use them was not our primary way of doing ministry, right? So um, before the pandemic, if you were to live stream a worship service at FPC, my assumption would be that you were on vacation, you're out of town, or you were home with somebody who was sick, or whatever the case may be. But we generally focused on having worship in person. That changed very quickly in March when we went from all in person to all online. And we had to learn a lot of things as we went, and there were growing pains with that. There was working out of technology. There was a lot of pivoting there. My assessment is that we did that very well. Of course, with technology, there are hiccups, there are bugs, but we're now at the point where I would classify us as a hybrid church, but mostly online. And I say that because we are open for worship on Sunday morning. We are in person, but we are still engaging a large number of people online in worship on Sunday morning. We also have done a lot more to share content and to share worship throughout the week on social media, which I think is awesome. To share, we've got these beautifully talented people who worship God in the most beautiful ways, with Dr. Cook and Bryant and Sarah, who played on Sunday. Um, and it's a shame when you look back that we reserved that for Sunday morning and only if you were here, but now we're sharing that out through the week. And so that's kind of where we are now with online worship. It's Sunday morning. We're growing out of that, I see, and we're growing our knowledge and our ability to use digital tools and the technology to engage in worship on Sunday morning. Not without its growing pains, I will admit. We've had some struggles. We've learned from them. We've learned a lot. But we're now in a season where we're building a strategy for what kind of a cohesive online ministry model. What's it going to look like? Let's take all we've learned. We've done some amazing things this year, and let's focus on making it worship. Let's let the church be the church on Sunday morning, in person and online. So that's where I see us now. And then, discipleship, the master classes, this is awesome. I don't see this format going away anytime soon. Even when we do return to like Wednesday nights, if we do at some point, or those types of things, I think we'll always have an online component. Like I said earlier, it is so cool to me that that Ashley Sherman from California tunes in to these master classes and stays connected with us. My mom is in New Jersey, and she worships with us every Sunday morning, and that's awesome. I love that. So I think right now we're in. If I had to kind of give an analogy, right, as an online church model, or our online ministry, right? I'll say our online ministry is sort of in its awkward middle school years, right? We're about to hit our teens, where we're going to do some real cool stuff, and we're going to learn some cool stuff, but we're still growing. So that's where I see us now, and that's kind of where I see us in the future. But I would classify us, or I see us in our calling as a church, as a hybrid church, as we are a church that is called to seek Christ and to share His love in person in the community, in the city, in the world, online, face to face, from our sanctuaries to our classrooms. That's where I see us going. But I see on the horizon us definitely honing and sharpening our skills with the tools that we have to do that. And also the exciting thing, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, is I see a very fertile ground for engaging the body of the church in that. There's ways to engage, and I'm just sort of on the cusp of learning about this, but ways to engage volunteers and prayer teams and teachers and all of those things through online ministry, and how to build those tools into how we worship, how we disciple, and how we care for one another pastorally. So that's how I see FPC as an online. We're technically a hybrid church, is what the industry lingo would be for our model of ministry.
So when I hear hybrid, Joel, I hear runs on batteries, runs on gas. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Hybrid meaning both, right? So a hybrid car has a gas engine and a battery engine. A hybrid church has face-to-face fellowship, worship, community, and online tools as well for discipleship and spiritual formation.
Can you speak a little bit to what that means as we understand unity in the church?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's great question. And so here's the challenge in that. And it, as I said, I've been in this process where there's things I get super hopeful about, and then there's things that kind of give me pause and are a little bit frightening. One of the most frightening things I've heard recently in church models, because this is all new for so many of us, is that somebody used the term dual congregation church, meaning that on Sunday morning, there's the congregation that's in person, and then there's the congregation that's online. That sort of broke my heart, right? Because for a church leader to look at their church and to see two different groups of people and not the church, I don't know. And I don't think they were being intentionally nefarious, or I don't think it was intentionally negative thing, but it kind of rattled me a little bit, because from the unity of the church, there's not the online church and the in-person church. There's the church, right? And so I think about it as, to use an analogy from pre-pandemic, at FPC, we had 3 worship services. We had 2 traditional and a contemporary. The people that worshiped at contemporary were not a different church than the people who were at traditional. And we've always done things to try to engage in unity between them. So like fellowship time between services. So now the creative opportunity is, how do we generate fellowship between the people who choose to worship in person and the people who worship and choose to worship and engage online? And there's so many creative ways to do that. But I think there's intentionality in that as well, because I think from a human standpoint, from us wanting things to be easy to manage and easy to compartmentalize and to keep control over, the temptation, I think the not a kingdom not a good temptation. I think a sort of an adversarial temptation is to keep them separate so that we can manage them. But that's the conversation I think that that needs to happen in the church, is the unity. And it's really interesting. There's a number of ways to get at it, but some of the really interesting things are simple, but important. And that is, looking at worship, when I get up in the lectern to lead in prayer, do I acknowledge and do I include and engage people who are worshiping online the same way that I engage people in person? And so I think those are the things where someone like me, who is the director of online ministry, one of the things I see as my role is holding people accountable to that. So Valina, if you get up on a Sunday morning and you're only engaging with the people who are in the room, I would lovingly kind of pull you aside and say, how can we better engage everybody in unity? The other thing that we do that's beautiful, that transcends this online versus in-person fellowship, is our parking lot parties. Like we've got the Dos de Mayo come up. So people who are geographically here, that's a beautiful thing to see so many people. And at the last one, I saw people at the last one that I hadn't seen in a year. And we automatically re-engage. It's like a family member who doesn't live in the same state as you. You're still family. You still love each other. You still engage with one another. It's just you find different tools and different avenues to do that. And I think I think we in our church DNA, in who we are, we're wired to do that, which is amazingly beautiful. And I am so blessed that we're here. One of the things I'd love to see is how can we nurture that unity as we develop this hybrid and as we engage in this hybrid way of worshiping and doing church.
Yeah, it's definitely exciting to think about how creative we have to be. And that's definitely something that I'm hearing you say, the pandemic is a catalyst, not a cause, and it's definitely a catalyst. One of the things that will accelerate our ministry is being creative about where we are right here and right now.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
Have you seen in other churches that are this hybrid model, or even churches that are more virtual than they are in person, things that we could grow into at FPC?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the exciting things there's tons of things out there that one of the things that the pandemic has catalyzed across all industry areas and all spheres of life is creativity. And that's no different for the church. One of the things that is really cool, so the kind of I'm trying to think of an analogy. The top dog in the online ministry world, the like go-to guru of online ministry is Craig Groeschel. Craig Groeschel is the senior pastor, founder of Life Church. He's also the creator of the Bible app, which many of us use. And a tangent note on that, Donnie Hussey, who is a member of our church, and they moved to Florida recently, he and I just did a Bible study together through the Bible app, where we would read the same thing each day and comment on what we read and read each other's comments. So just a little plug there for the cool online ministry tools that are there. So anyway, he created this Bible app. He also created the live online church streaming platform that we're starting to use. But his church said, why does worship only have to be on Sunday morning? And why do we only have to have one service? And they have like over 300 services a week throughout the week that are led and preached and done by people from all over the world. And they're just widely attended. And so for them, I mean, that's their church model. They're all online. But I think, to go back to your question, how can we be creative? We worship on Sunday morning, but we've got tools now and we've got technology. Are there ways we can do worship during the week? How can we engage and create access to prayer and to worship and musical worship? Just all the things. And the creative part of that is I always like to say, if the only reason, and this is not just in church, this is in my life, good life philosophy, right? If the only reason I do something is because that's the way it's always been done, that's not a good enough reason for me to do it. And so the pandemic has given us license to say, the sky's the limit. How can we be creative? And so how can we look outside of some of those traditional constraints that we put on ourselves as far as limiting to time of week? Some of the other things, like the Bible studies, Zoom groups, these master classes are a great example of the creativity of what other people are doing. But I will say, and this may come across as boastful, but it is what it is. From what I've seen from churches that were not primarily online before the pandemic and now are, we tend to be a little bit further ahead in that we were willing to be creative sooner. And what I mean by that is a lot of churches waited until the hand was forced to do certain things. Like okay, pandemic starts March 13th, everything shuts down. We've got to worship online. We've never done it before. We do it, Facebook, Zoom, however we do it. And then that's all we're going to do for now, because that's what we've got to do. And that's fine. And that's, but then when they realize we've got to start doing discipleship, this is going to last more than 6 weeks. That's when people have decided to sort of dig into those things. What I've noticed is that we're ahead of the curve. Like, let's be creative now. Let's start worshiping, engaging in discipleship, doing these things now. And so, yeah, there's essentially the sky's the limit. The church is the church. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Joel. Just another, it's kind of an observation. So this is more of a conversation question than anything else, straight from me. So it's been interesting to me that since we've gone virtual, and so many things are like classes are virtual, it's interesting to me that our building is being used in a different way. So we've basically become a homeless shelter since December 2nd, and that's continued. It's been something that's we've just added more time, which has been great. And the other big usage of the building is the preschool. So it's almost like our physical building, our facility, our campus is being, not that it wasn't ministry centered before, but it's ministry centered in a different kind of way. Can you speak to that? Have you seen that in trends in other congregations?
I can speak to that. I have not. So absolutely agree. That has been, one of the beautiful things when you stop and you look at, like I said at the start, I love to do these like little mental kind of follow the logic, follow the rabbit trail kind of things. When you look at one effect or outcome of the pandemic, even if it's a negative one, and you just dwell on that, then of course it's negative. But when you follow like the chain of events, like you said, us closing the building and sort of moving online created perhaps this opportunity to house and to host our shelter program since December to April, for 6 months. And then the preschool being here, of course. And I think so. Before I talk about trends in other churches, I think that again speaks to who we are. And early on in the pandemic, I shared this thing on Facebook that a number of people responded to positively, and I just simply said, I shared this picture that someone else said that said, the building's not closed, but the church is open. And I think, again, to not sound boastful, but FPC lives into that, right? That we are not the building, we are the church. And so that's just another way to say that's how we have persevered. That's how we have what was the term that's how we got serious. That's how we persevered. That's how we were the church. Unfortunately, so what I have seen in a general sense is that's not the case across the board. And I'm just being candid, I haven't seen other churches that, because they've moved online, have now used their facility for something else. Generally speaking, the building remains closed, or if they're open for Sunday morning worship, or if they broadcast from their location on Sunday mornings, they're open. Now, that's just what I've observed. I have also seen a number of churches that have responded early on in the pandemic, especially when people were particularly homebound, when most of us were homebound, that responded by setting up and going, right? And using their church as a center of food distribution to have their people rally, load their cars up with meals, and take them to the members of their congregation who are particularly vulnerable. So I have seen that a lot, particularly early on. Nothing on the scale of the homeless shelter, but again, I do see that, and I think to go back to my earlier comment, how I tend to feel like we're on the front end of the curve of willingness to try new things. I think as we now, so I should define that as well. We're technically now just now entering the post-pandemic season. I don't think we're fully in it. So there's the pandemic, post-pandemic, and then the term that I've used, scholars use, is reemergence. And I think, as best as I understand it, that's when, on a concrete side, when we hit herd immunity, and then all restrictions, according to the CDC, can be lifted and life can resume pre-pandemic. That's reemergence. That's a ways off by most predictions. But I think as we enter the post-pandemic season, where we're kind of in between this shutdown and this reemergence, I truly believe that a lot of individual congregations, churches will begin, I think we will see the building as a hub of ministry, not of the congregation. And what I mean by that is I think we will see the church as the hub of fellowship, like the way we use our parking lot. So many churches are doing these drive-through Easter events and these drive-through barbecues and discipleship nights and worship nights. And so and it's for the community, right? They invite everybody. So I think as we are entering this post-pandemic season, I think that I believe we will see what's on the horizon is that the church will become smaller, because we know, right, church membership is shrinking. But I think it'll become a hub of fellowship and ministry, and not look at our building, right? A lot of people talk about this. One of the effects of the pandemic is that people held this view of their building as it was sacred, and they wouldn't use it for ministry purposes, but or for community outreach, those types of things. But then those same churches were hosting blood drives, hosting food drives, doing those types of things. And so I think we will see this shift in thinking about what the church building is, and that it's a hub of ministry. It's a hub of the church, of how we do church, but the church is transcendent. I mean, the church transcends the building. So I think that's what's on the horizon in this next season.
Awesome. Joel, we're at time, but there's one more question. So I'm going to ask the question and then also ask you to make any closing remarks that you'd like to make. This question is from Ashley Sherman, and I share that because of the question she asks. So she asked, how do we make sure to keep the face-to-face contact with fellowship going in an online world? Online is awesome and has kept me connected, but a hug goes a long way too.
Absolutely, 100% couldn't agree more. Nat talked about this yesterday, and I really appreciate that he did when he was talking about Zoom. Zoom is great, but psychologists, sociologists, ministry care professionals, everybody agrees, and we know that this does not replace human interaction. And so that's a great question. And it's a challenge for us in its nuance, because it's a case-by-case basis, right? If people are isolated because of health risks and situations, we can be creative about how we contact, but we also have to honor them by keeping them safe. But that is, so to go back to my kind of thought about how we're entering this post-pandemic season, and as vaccines become more available and more of the population becomes available, what I think we'll see is that I think people will stay online for a number of things, or continue to engage online, not out of necessity, but out of just a choice to do so. And I'm not disparaging that. I think that's great. I think having your living room as your center of worship is awesome. And if you are engaged more in worship and doing that with your family, I think that's great. But that doesn't replace fellowship and human interaction. And so to go back to something we're already doing, like these parking lot events, I think that is awesome. One of the big challenges, and I'm glad Ashley asked this question because she's a prime example of this. Something that I've been wrestling with is if we have people engage with us in our church that are not geographically local, how do we nurture them? Because I believe that that person needs physical community, needs human interaction, and that's the only thing I can't provide. We can give them access to everything else: worship, discipleship, pastoral care, prayer. Um, but there's no digital way that I can provide that community. So I think going forward, that's why I believe we're called, and I believe all churches that do online ministry are called to be hybrid, because I do not believe that online ministry solely online is enough for your spiritual formation. I believe everybody needs to be in relationship, in close and deep relationships. um, Online social media gives us access to many connections and relationships, but they're not deep. And so that is sort of the challenge. That's the big question that I'll leave hanging, is and sort of a like I said, it's one I wrestle with, and I think it's one that the church has a responsibility in discipling their people. We have, as an online director of ministry, I have a responsibility to engage people in online worship, but also to remind them from a pastoral care standpoint that you need community. And if there's ways I can help you engage with that, I would love to do that. But please don't take what we do as a replacement for human interaction. So um, that's the answer I have for that. That's truly, that is kind of a big part of the conversation now. So great question, Ashley. Thanks for asking that. And so on that note, the final thing I want to say is that I hope I communicated clearly enough how hopeful, how joyful, how optimistic, and how excitedly I look towards what's on the horizon in the life of the church. Because looking back at the through scripture and where the church has been, and the context around the church through history, and how the church is the church, that keeps me overwhelmingly hopeful and joyful for what's next. And I do know, I'm not foolish. I know that there will be some growing pains and hiccups along the way, but ultimately the church is the church, and I'm excited.
Awesome. Thanks, Joel. And